Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcial Boo, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. And on this month's podcast, I've got the great pleasure of speaking to Stephen Gibson, the Chair of the UK Government's Regulatory Policy Committee. This is an independent scrutiny body that assesses the quality of evidence and analysis in regulatory proposals with the aim of helping to produce better regulation. And Stephen's well placed to lead the RPC. He's got over 30 years' experience as an economist in transport, utilities and telecoms, including in Ofwat, Ofcom, the Civil Aviation Authority and the Office of Rail and Road. He's also a senior fellow at both the London School of Economics and the Kennedy School of Business and Government at Harvard, which is a really impressive track record. Welcome, Stephen.
Lovely to be with you, Marcial.
It's lovely to have you. So before we talk about the role of the Regulatory Policy Committee, let's talk about your own background. I mentioned all of the impressive places you've worked, but tell us how you got into regulation and what kept you there.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting story. So I did a degree in economics and then did a master's in computer science. And I thought I wanted to actually work in computing. So my first job was working as a computer programmer and I hated it. And I didn't want my boss's job. I didn't want my boss's job. So I was sort of looking around for something else. And at the time, the Royal Mail was advertising for a junior economist. And I got that role. And that was the time in the early 90s when Michael Heseltine was looking to privatise Royal Mail. It didn't actually go ahead, but I was seconded onto the team to do a bit of work on privatisation. And at that time, British Rail was thinking of being split up into Railtrack and the different train operators and privatised. And I moved across to British Rail, to the Railtrack bit of it, and worked on privatisation. And then privatisation inevitably led to sort of regulation with the setting of the initial access charges and the periodic review of the access charges, which I led all the review of the incentives. And then sort of that moved me into regulation. I worked at, as you said, Ofcom and Postcom, etc. And then I sort of reinvented myself a little bit in 2011. Postcom, where I was the chief economist, was being merged back into Ofcom. And I'd already been at Ofcom and I didn't really want to go back there. So I did something I've been thinking about for a while, which is to set myself up as a consultancy. I set up SLG Economics to provide regulatory advice to governments, regulators and regulated companies. And that included stints at ORR and CAA and others. And that sort of was really interesting consultancy work. And then again, sort of another change in 2018, I applied to be a member of the Regulatory Policy Committee to work on impact assessments and cost-benefit analysis. Then in 2019, I was appointed as the chair. And that's been an amazing experience. And I've really enjoyed the sort of applying economics to public policy questions. And it's also given me the flexibility to take on some academic research. So I've spent the last 3 years in parallel with my RPC work as a senior fellow at as you said, at the Harvard Kennedy School, researching into better regulation, running workshops on regulation and giving seminars and lectures at Harvard. And that sort of supports and cross-fertilizes with my work at the RPC.
It's fantastic. It's an amazing range of background, and I know that we're going to talk about the RPC in a bit more detail shortly. But we've also had economists and academics on this podcast before talking about regulation in various ways, and so it's such a wide field. Regulation, as obviously you know, that input comes from different people in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and so having that kind of deep economic expertise, I'm sure, is of massive help to the organisations that you've worked in. And indeed, many regulators rely on numerical analysis of one kind or another in order for them to do a good job, not just economics, obviously, but statistics and many other fields as well. So, absolutely fascinating. Before we talk about the RPC, then, what's the kind of, as I said, what keeps you in regulation? What is it that really makes you interested to stay in this sector?
Well, I love the fact that it is the application of a theoretical area, theoretical studies to practical applications. So, over my career, I've been involved in both rail privatization and setting access charges, regulating telecoms companies and thinking about the regulation of BT. I've been involved in the third runway at Heathrow and the plans, developing the economic framework for a runway which never actually happened, but nonetheless posed some really challenging problems about how you refund assets that have a 25 to 30 or 50-year asset life over a time period that will allow them to be financed by investors. I've worked on public policy issues from Brexit to sort of tobacco regulation and gambling regulation. So it's the range of different activity that I've been able to apply economic principles to hopefully help make regulations a bit better.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And in all of those examples that you've just adduced there have been arguments in different directions, in favour or against investing, in favour or against doing something. And I know that all regulators in different sectors, even those that are not economic regulators, obviously are trying to balance the different needs of different groups when they're making their regulatory decisions. So let's move on to the Regulatory Policy Committee. I summarised its role very, very briefly at the beginning, but perhaps you can tell us in a bit more detail what the committee does.
Okay, so the RPC is the Independent Better Regulation Watchdog. So like the National Audit Office, for example, is the government's public spending watchdog, we have a similar function regarding to regulation. So whenever a government department wants to introduce a new regulation, which has an impact on businesses or civil society or consumers, they have to produce an assessment of what the impacts are likely to be. They have to say what the objectives of the regulation are, what alternative policy options have been considered, how they justify their policy choice, what the expected costs and benefits of the preferred proposal might be, any risks that they may introduce, and set out their expectations about the impacts of the regulation. We then review that assessment and produce an opinion which is provided to Parliament to inform the parliamentary debate about the proposed legislation, and is published on our website to inform external stakeholders about our views about the quality of evidence and analysis supporting the government proposals.
And this is for all new regulations that government departments propose, is that right?
For all regulations above a minimum level of £10 million per annum, and those that have an impact on business. So not ones where they're regulating other parts of the public sector.
Okay, and what about professionals, people who are, architects or GPs or whoever else? I mean,
so if it's a government regulation that says a new act that means that architects have to abide by a certain new regulatory standards, then that will come to us. If it was something done by a professional regulator, then that's their role.
Okay. And so the goal is to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs, crudely.
Well, hopefully, but also to set out what the expected impacts are. So it can be the case that the benefits outweigh the costs, but if all the benefits fall on one group of stakeholders and all the costs fall on another, and maybe the costs fall on vulnerable members of society or particular groups that you'd be concerned about, then that's something that needs to be taken account of in moving forward with the legislation, and to think about what the risks are, because it's not just the case that the central estimate of both the costs and benefits gives you all the information about what's the aspects of the regulation may be. It may be that in certain circumstances, you can have some very bad outcomes that you might want to avoid. And in fact, that might be the purpose of the regulation, to avoid those particularly bad outcomes.
Yes. And I imagine that you're thinking not just about the current generation, but about future generations too, and trying to kind of calculate the potential longer-term benefits and risks of different proposals as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we will look at long-term as well as short-term costs and benefits. and discount them using sort of the government green book tools. But sometimes it's the case that you can't simply quantify everything. And it's important to have a qualitative assessment of what the impacts might be, even if you can't put a number on them. And there, sometimes you use something like break-even analysis, which says the costs of this regulation may be, let's say, £100 million. We don't know what the benefits are, but can we reasonably assert that those benefits, as we outline them, are more than £100 million? In which case, it may be a sensible thing to do. Whereas if we can't make the case that they're at least the level of the costs, then there may be questions about the regulation.
Obviously, yeah, good. Okay, so give us some examples of recent work or ongoing work that you've been involved in at the RPC.
Well, we have a constant stream of assessments coming through. We look at over 100 a year, so around 2 a week. Some of the recent ones have been, for example, the Home Office Crime and Policing Bill, which proposed to introduce powers to suspend internet addresses for serious crime and prevent the supply and possession of SIM farms for fraud, and making possession of electronic devices used in vehicle theft a criminal offence. Others are things like the pensions schemes bill, which is about changing the approach to delivering pensions. Perhaps one of the big ones recently has been the Employment Rights Bill, which was very much in the press about giving workers rights, day one rights, at a much earlier stage in their employment contract. And there, we actually red-rated that as not fit for purpose because we didn't think the government had properly gone through the process of thinking about different policy options to achieve their policy objectives. So it was a manifesto commitment, so the government went through with it, and we are advisory. We can't prevent a democratically elected government from making policy, and we shouldn't. But we were able to advise Parliament and stakeholders about what we thought about the quality of the options assessment.
That's a really interesting example because what you're talking about, obviously, like all regulatory work, abuts politics because there are judgments involved about whether to do something or not to do something. And often those are political judgments that need to be made. So you're clear that the work that your committee is doing is obviously, as you say, advisory to provide expert evidence to Parliament on the way in which the government is proposing to take forward their regulatory responsibilities. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that captures it very well.
Excellent. And so you highlighted that example of the Employment Rights Bill, where you say that you argued for consideration of other ways of achieving the policy outcomes. Are there other examples of differences that your committee's work has made, or things that you're proud of contributing to?
Okay, so a recent one. Part of the better regulation framework is the requirement for government departments, when they introduce regulations, to review them sort of 3 to 5 years after they've been introduced. And it's actually a statutory requirement to review it within that 5-year timescale. And that's really sensible and really important because regulations, even if they're well framed first off, things change. Markets change, technology changes, and you learn a lot about a regulation by implementing it and by seeing it happen in practice. And there may be cases where regulations introduce unintended consequences or perverse incentives. And these post-implementation reviews allow government to think about whether the regulation should be kept, whether it should be revised or amended in some way, or maybe even whether it should be removed or replaced by something else. However, although the government has signed up to the requirement to do this, for a long time, government departments have not actually been very good at completing their post-implementation reviews. Less than half of PIRs have been completed within the statutory timeframe. So we've had a long-running program to try and encourage departments to do better and be more compliant. And most recently, I wrote to the permanent secretaries of the different departments and got commitments from them to make good to catch up on the backlog of outstanding post-implementation reviews. And we've actually published a league table of the offending departments. Department of Transport was the worst offender, I'm afraid.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. And to give them an incentive to improve on their performance. And now we have those sort of strong commitments. We will be monitoring and calling them out if they don't make good on what they've agreed to do.
Well, that's very good. I'm very impressed, Stephen, and well done. And I'm a great fan of post-implementation reviews of any kind. And one of the issues that many regulators I know have is that, as you say, society moves on, technology moves on, demography moves on, and sometimes the law, as well as the regulations that they're working within, are no longer quite as current or up to date as they should be. And many regulators find that quite frustrating because they want to be able to regulate efficiently, but they're constrained by old rules. Now, obviously, all governments are worrying about tomorrow's problems rather than yesterday's. So do you think that the departments will have the capacity to go back and look at not just the regulations that they've implemented in the last 3 to 5 years, but ones that perhaps 10 to 20 years old?
Well, this is always a challenge. And it's not just a matter of capacity. People don't get promoted by looking at old regulation and saying, is it working well or not, particularly when the majority of it may well be working very well. So you do all this work and you say nothing to see here. So it is difficult to motivate departments to do that work, to review it. But it is really, really important because, as you say, society moves on, things change, priorities change. And in order to make sure that our entire regulatory framework remains fit for purpose and appropriate to today's technology and today's society, it is really important that governments actually do that. At least as important, in my view, as just looking at the next shiny bit of new legislation that they want to introduce.
Yeah, I'm completely 100% behind you on that one, Stephen. And I know that we've spoken to people in the VETS regulator who are working off legislation that was passed in 1966. The Civil Aviation Authority, I believe, also, it needs to have some ability to regulate the air brought up to date as well. So it's really important work. So stepping back from some of these particulars, from your professional experience and from your work chairing the RPC, how would you summarize what good regulation looks like to you?
Okay. I think good regulation is regulation that achieves its policy objectives in the most efficient way possible. That means without imposing unnecessary additional costs and being effective. Now, one can have different views on the policy objectives, but that's different from the quality of the regulation that achieves those objectives. And a really great example of this is the 10p charge on single-use plastic bags. It was introduced 7 or 8 years ago. Now, if you think about that, when you go out and do your weekly shop out, you may spend £100, £150 on a family's weekly shop. The difference between buying a few extra plastic bags and not is less than the difference between 2 boxes of cereal. It's certainly not a significant part of the family shop, but that regulation, that nudge has made a huge difference to people's behaviour. There's been over 90% reduction in the use of plastic bags as a result of that proposal. So it's been incredibly effective at a tiny cost to society, to consumers and to the shops themselves.
That's a really good example. And all of us who are perhaps of a certain generation, let me just put it like that, will remember some of these social changes that have taken place in the last few decades, like the banning of smoking in public places and so on and so forth, which was questioned before it was introduced. And I know that was the case for this example that you've just drawn to our attention. So it's really good to know that we can look back at those examples and draw lessons from those when we're thinking about future regulation too. Good. Okay. So You've obviously talked about some of the work that you've done to make sure regulation is implemented well from the outset. And you've given an overview of what good regulation looks like. We know that this government, as previous governments, is keen to reduce regulatory burdens, regulatory costs on business particularly. Do you have a view on how that's going and what regulators need to do?
Okay, well, the Chancellor introduced a government commitment to reduce the administrative costs of regulation by 25% during the life of this Parliament. She introduced that back in March. Now, I think that's a really ambitious target. The previous government had aimed to keep the total cost of regulation during the last Parliament stable. They ended up increasing it by over £14 billion in the first 3 years of the Parliament before abandoning their target.
Well, I didn't know that, actually. That's quite a big number.
It's a very big number. The 2017 Parliament, they aimed to reduce the burden of regulation by £9 billion, and they ended up increasing it by £7.8 billion.
Oh dear.
So there is a history of governments setting targets and then missing them by quite a lot. And there's a good reason why governments often fail to meet these targets, and that's because they have lots of other things they want to achieve, whether it's net zero, whether it's levelling up, whether it's improving the quality of the food that we eat, or reducing smoking, or gambling, or reducing crime, etc. And all of these, regulating all of these activities, does impose costs on different elements of society. So therefore, when the government's targets come up against other government objectives, they don't always win out. And so I'm very happy that the government has recognised that regulations are important. Regulations impose huge costs on businesses and on society. But I think it is a very ambitious target to achieve, and I think trying to do that will be a very big ask.
Yes, well, goodness me, on the basis of the numbers that you've just given us, very challenging indeed. And when I went through the manifestos of all the parties, big and small, they were all proposing changes to regulation, including the creation and abolition of different regulators. And this government, now the Labour government that's been elected, is both challenging us to reduce regulatory costs legitimately and creating new regulators too. An Armed Forces Commissioner, the legislation's going through there. The independent football regulator is better known. So apart from helping regulators to think about the regulatory burdens they're imposing on business, what else can the government do you think, to help regulators to improve their work?
Okay. Well, one of the problems faced by many of the regulators, all the regulators that I've worked with, is they have a very long list of potentially conflicting objectives, duties, things they have to have regard to. And indeed, the government made that list even longer recently by adding a growth duty to the duties to promote efficiency, competition, the environment, allowing businesses to finance their activities, supporting safety, supporting disadvantaged customers, etc. And in the early days of regulation, it was much easier where the Director Generals had a clear objective to regulate market power. Now, regulators are sort of pulled in a number of different directions, and it's very difficult to see what their real objective is, how they trade off between these potentially conflicting aims. And I think government can really help regulators by focusing their duties, giving them strategic direction, and giving them a sense of how they trade off, how they balance those different objectives, and actually sort of, just focusing them and making them fewer and more well specified.
Yes. Well, that's a really important point. I know that lots of regulators are grappling with this. And as you say, the growth duty is just one extra thing for many regulators to think about. And for those that are not economic regulators regulating business, that's a hard one to understand. I regulate insolvency and bankruptcy at the moment, And so if I'm trying to stimulate growth, I hope I'm not trying to stimulate more insolvencies. That's not what we want. And I know the Food Standards Agency has said to me that that although their prime duty is to keep food safe, they also have environmental objectives, which mitigate, as it were, against wrapping food in plastic, which is a really good way of keeping things safe. So, these are difficult trade-offs that regulators are having to take responsibility for, and sometimes politicians, with apologies to them, are reluctant to make these calls because they want everything to be important. So in practice, how can government help regulators to make these decisions about what to focus on?
Well, by making everything important, you make nothing important. Government. It's government's job to actually think about what are the real priorities. And giving the Office of Rail and Road, for example, 30 different objectives and duties. When I lecture to my students, I can't even get all the objectives on one slide. I need a second slide to sort of list them all out. Just means that regulators do their best. They try and do a good job. But regulators should be led in their strategic objectives by government, by what government wants to prioritize. Do they want to prioritize growth, or the environment, or competition, or trade, or other helping disadvantaged customers, or other objectives? And that is the role of government, to set those objectives. Regulators are all about implementing, using their powers to change licenses, to enforce rules, to sort of set charges, etc., that achieve those objectives. But unless the government is specific about what the objectives are, I think it gives them an impossible job.
Yeah, well, again, completely agree, Stephen. And I'm absolutely committed to democratic accountability, and regulators need to take their guidance from elected politicians. And as you say, that guidance needs to be as clear and as focused as possible to help regulators do a good job. Now then, towards the end now, just thinking about some ways in which regulators can be helped. I'm going to ask you in a moment for a couple of tips to leave regulators with, as it were, things that you'd suggest that they do. But before that, obviously, I'm here for the Institute of Regulation, a professional body to help regulators. What can professional bodies like us do to help the sector to improve?
Okay, well, one thing I've observed from moving across different regulated sectors is that the same problems and challenges are often faced in different circumstances. And there's a real danger that we keep on trying to reinvent the wheel. And the Institute of Regulation is great for allowing professionals to share their experience and expertise so that we can see where a problem in one sector relates to a solution in a different area. So I'm a big supporter of the Institute, and I look forward to attending many more of your events.
Excellent. Well, please recommend us to others, and you're very, very welcome, obviously, to come back to any events and to speak to people as well, who I know will be interested in the work of your committee and your own background as well. So finally, Stephen, any tips to people listening to this podcast who want to improve their own regulatory practice?
Well, keep listening. I mean, there are lots of insights you can pick up from hearing about developments in other areas of regulation. And, your podcast, which I listen to, sort of all the time, are a great way to pick them up. So, so keep listening.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen Gibson. It's great to hear about your work chairing the government's Regulatory Policy Committee. And those of you listening, like Stephen, to this podcast can find out more about the RPC's work by going to the .gov.uk website and searching for the RPC there. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman of Bowerman Audio Production. And if you found this discussion interesting, please tell your colleagues about it. Tune in to future episodes of this regulation podcast with me, Marcial Boo, where we'll discuss more issues of interest to regulators. And there's more material, events and training on the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. In the meantime, good luck with your own regulatory challenges and stay in touch to help UK regulation become the best it can. Goodbye.